For the next 2 episodes of the Discover the Word podcast, we're looking forward to having a guest at the table with us. Dr. Michelle Knight is an Old Testament professor at TEDS, Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in the Chicago area. And she's going to walk with us through a section of the Bible that we don't go to all that much, the Old Testament book of Judges.
Judges isn't exactly a, hey, this will be fun to read book.
Because there's some pretty gnarly stuff that happens in the book of Judges.
Yeah.
It's honestly a pleasure. I feel like when I read Judges, I see a lot of the most pressing problems of our day. And so it's worth the hard work.
Yeah, it's not an easy part of the Old Testament to read. It raises a lot of questions about people and about what God is like. But as you heard, the lens through which Michelle will help us read this section of Israel's history may help you make a shift in the way you think about the times of the Judges. Because is Judges primarily a record of people messing up? Or is there a bigger, even more important message that it contains about what God is like? Well, I'm excited to get started in this series of conversations called The Times of the Judges, here on Discover the Word. Well, hi, I'm Brian Hettinga. This is Discover the Word, Bible engagement from Our Daily Bread Ministries in the form of a small group Bible study in which we invite you to join us in exploring topics and passages that inform the way we read Scripture, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and point us to discover Jesus, the living Word of God, in the pages of the written Word. Bill Crowder, Vivian Mabuni, and Daniel Ryan Day are the regular group members who are at the table with Old Testament scholar and professor Dr. Michelle Knight. And so the section of Scripture we're going to is not completely unknown to us. There are some names and some stories in Judges that you'll recognize, like Samson and Gideon. But even so, the stories do have, what did Bill call it, some pretty gnarly stuff in them, and that is true. But I don't think you'll read this book about the times of the Judges in the same way after you've been part of these conversations. And so let's pull our chairs up to the table as Bill and Daniel and Vivian welcome Michelle Knight to Discover the Word.
If you could see what I see right now, Michelle has her laptop open, reads the Bible in Hebrew, but is going to actually walk us through in these times together right now, the book of Judges. And so thank you for being with us, Michelle. Welcome to Discover the Word.
Thank you so much. I'm really pleased to be here.
Yeah, and way to be brave and come in on one of the more awkward, difficult books in the Old Testament, too. Because Judges isn't exactly a, hey, this will be fun to read book.
And we were talking off mic, it's not exactly a book that creates a lot of good children's Bible stories, because there's some pretty gnarly stuff that happens in the book of Judges.
True.
So thanks for tackling a tough one for us.
Yeah.
It's honestly a pleasure. I feel like when I read Judges, I see a lot of the most pressing problems of our day. And so it's worth the hard work.
Well, where are you going to start us off?
Well, I thought it might be helpful before we jump into the book of Judges. I kind of want to give us a little bit of a background for where I feel like the Old Testament has pushed us so far. And I'm doing this for a couple reasons. One of them is I just want you to kind of see a trajectory in the way that the Old Testament's been talking to this point, so we can kind of trace how that development continues. But I think more importantly, I want to give some nuance to the way we kind of tend to see the Old Testament as a whole. Okay. I mean, I know a couple of you are pastors or have been pastors. What are some common concerns with reading the Old Testament?
Well, the easy thing is to turn it into a bunch of principles.
Yeah.
And whether or not those principles are valid is a whole nother issue. But that's kind of the easy default kind of tendency is to principalize the Old Testament text.
Yeah.
Or to make heroes out of people that really aren't heroes.
Yeah. Or maybe they did a heroic thing, but the rest of their life really doesn't rise to that level. Yeah.
Well, and I think you've touched on a couple things that I would really want to highlight. And that's that we have this tendency to look at the Old Testament and we get really focused on the people. Mm-hmm. And it's like, are they doing things right or are they doing things wrong? Yeah. Are they good guys or are they bad guys?
Should we do what they're doing? Should
Exactly.
we not? Yeah.
And that tends to be kind of our default mode when we preach too, is like, is this someone we should emulate or should we avoid? And a lot of stories in the Old Testament invite us to do that. But I think if we're not careful, we totally miss this other trajectory, which is God trying to fix a broken world through really imperfect people. And frankly, the fact that they're imperfect is like a feature, not a bug.
Right.
And we tend to turn it into a bug. And we get so fixated on their unfaithfulness, we can kind of miss what God is doing to work through them. And so one of the things I love pointing out when we get to Judges, I was taught as I read Judges, at least initially, that this was kind of a book that shows the failure of the people. Mm-hmm. And that is absolutely true on one level. But what's fascinating is that makes the story all about the people. We actually get to watch God do quite a bit in the book of Judges as we do elsewhere. And what he's been doing in the Pentateuch to this point is actually, I would argue, really about making himself known. And that's what makes the Old Testament so different from other ancient Near Eastern myths and all kinds of other stories we hear. God doesn't need us. He didn't make us to serve him just because he needed help or something. Right. He made us to delight in us. So if that's the case, it can't just be a story about God getting mad that we're not doing things his way.
Yeah, that's a good way to set it up too, because it reminds me of the story of Abraham, which is where this people group somewhat begins.
Yeah.
And the fact that when God adopts, so to speak, Abraham and his family, the whole point of that is, I'm going to teach you to be a new kind of people that reflect me and my love in the world.
Yeah.
And then as a result of that, you'll be a blessing to all people.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And all of that is to fix what was broken when we tried to do things our way. Mm-hmm. The initial world God created was one where we just worked, where things worked peacefully and wholly and beautifully. And he's trying to push us back toward that. And so especially as we work our way toward Judges, what's fascinating to me is especially in Exodus, we see it again in Joshua. The major kind of thrust of that literature is that God is trying to prove to his people what kind of God he is. Mm-hmm. And that's actually going to continue in Judges. It's not just about, are these guys good or bad? It's, are they responding to the revelation of God?
After 400 years in Egypt, the people had drifted. They had embraced, to some degree, some of the gods of Egypt and so forth. And so before God could make them his people, he had to reintroduce himself to them.
That's right.
So they could know who he was and why he was different from those gods that they had drifted to in Egypt.
Absolutely. While at the same time showing that some of the things you like about those gods, I'm actually that, but better.
Yeah.
So God will talk about, I'm going to redeem you with a strong right arm. We have all these cave drawings of Pharaoh's arm looking all massive and big above his head. And God's twisting that and being if there's anybody with a strong right arm, it is absolutely me. But what I love about Exodus in particular is how God is clear that everything he is doing, it might have other purposes. The plagues, for example, they certainly were a judgment on Egypt, but far more they were about declaring not only to his people, but to the world what kind of God he was. I always tell my students it's like the book where God introduces himself.
Yeah, and what's so fascinating to me is that compared to all the other ancient Near Eastern religions, this whole story of Exodus sets Israelites apart. They are not like the surrounding nations to have this story of Exodus be a part of their narrative. Israel's God was so different because the gods that others worshipped created people to serve them so that they didn't have to work. Instead, Here was Yahweh trying to have relationship. And over I think it's easy for us to think of the Bible as these are the things you're supposed to do to get to God, and yet God is the one that is creating and drawing us to him. So I love that switch, because I think so often we interact with the Bible as, what am I supposed to do? What do I learn about me? Instead of who is God and what do I learn about God?
Absolutely.
And one of the things we've talked about a lot on the program, Michelle, is what some people call the meta-narrative,
That's right.
the overarching story of the Bible is God's work ultimately to rescue the broken world and restore it through his son Jesus. And every story in the Bible ultimately feeds into that story somehow.
Yeah.
And trying to make those connections gives you a bigger context than just, well, this person did this, don't do that,
Yeah.
Well, there might be validity in don't do what that person did, but there's a bigger story at play here.
Yeah.
And keep that in view.
Yeah. Well, and depending on what tradition you're from, some churches talk like this and some don't, but the law at its core is instruction. That's what the word Torah means in Hebrew. It's instruction.
Yeah.
And that law is designed to clarify for us, if God is in charge of this world and this evil is running rampant, how can we kind of curb those tendencies? The law is designed not to bring about a perfect society. There's still slavery. There's still inequality. But whatever the most evil intentions are, it curbs those. And it reins evil in and trains people to think differently about what to do. Even the law, even obedience is ultimately, did you decide that God's way of doing work
Was
in the
better.
world was better?
Yeah.
Or did you think that, no, my own way or the way of the people around me, that actually makes way more sense to me? So I think if I ever wrote an Old Testament theology, like if I ever tried to trace the meta-narrative of the Old Testament, I would call it, well, this would be a terrible title, so I wouldn't call it this, but I would trace the statement, so that you may know, throughout the Old Testament, because especially in Exodus, we start getting this refrain where God or Moses as a spokesperson is explaining what God is doing. And the purpose is always so that you would know. I mean, it is uncanny. Let me just read a couple. I'm going to just fly over Exodus. I'll zoom into a couple passages in a little bit, but let me just kind of fly over. We have in chapter 5, Pharaoh said, "Who's Yahweh, that I should obey his voice? I don't know him." So in 6:3, God says, "I appeared to Abraham, but by my name Yahweh, I didn't make myself known." 6:7, "I will take you to be my people, and you will know." 7:5, "The Egyptians will know that I'm Yahweh." 7:17, "By this you will know that I am Yahweh." 8:6, "Be it as you say, so that you may know there is no one like Yahweh our God." 8:18, "So that you may know that I'm Yahweh in the midst of the earth." And there are 18 times spread throughout this book where God just says, I am desperately trying to convince these people that I am a good God, I am the best God, and I am trying to draw you in. And of course, as we work through, we see the people see this. And there's actually this amazing thing that happens in Exodus where after all of this revelation, after God has rescued them, we have this note where the people have finally seen the Egyptians defeated on the shore and are finally like, oh, this is the Redeemer God. It worked. Like we have these like little evidences where God's revelatory work, like it actually sunk in.
Yep. And on the shore, that's where you have Moses and Miriam singing a song to God.
That's right.
All about who God is and that he is our rock whom we can trust and who saves us and rescues us and is our God.
That's exactly right. And what's cool is both this theme and that song actually come up in the book of Joshua, which immediately precedes Judges. In a lot of ways, Joshua is just kind of setting us up for what we need to understand Judges. I mean, it's doing something on its own as well, but it's laying the groundwork. And in Joshua, we'll see God one more time. He will part the Jordan River and make it look like the Red Sea. And Rahab, when they meet Rahab in the chapter before, she will quote that song of Moses. And it's evidence that it's not only God's people that heard and knew and learned, but foreigners, a Canaanite, heard this amazing testimony, absorbed it, and decided to become an Israelite because she had heard that this God was like that. And so as we kind of come to the book of Judges, we know we have a God who desperately wants us to know him, who wants to know us. And when he gives us instructions, when he tells us how to do things, he's teaching us so that we can know him better and so that we can partake in this really beautiful life.
And I think that is going to give us a fresh way of looking at these stories in the book of Judges. Dr. Michelle Knight joining the Discover the Word group for a study called The Times of the Judges. And that is a great foundational perspective for us to take into the rest of the conversation, that here in Judges, and actually all throughout the Old Testament, what we find is for the purpose of making God known. That is what he wants us to know that he's like. Well, years ago, we had a guest on Discover the Word who said something that has shaped our conversations ever since. His name is Sid Buzzle, and what he said was that truth discovered is most often more powerful than truth that is simply told. Experiential knowledge adds a dimension to book learning or just hearing a lecture. Truth discovered and experienced is more powerful than truth that is simply told. Well, that principle is going to show up in the next part of this conversation. Michelle is going to talk about how what she's going to call an experiential knowledge deficit may have been a factor in how the story of the Times of the Judges is told. Because it's true that truth discovered and experienced is more powerful than truth that is simply told. And so let's listen as Michelle begins the next part of this study of the Times of the Judges with a personal example of an experiential knowledge deficit.
So right now, my child is in T-ball, and I'm terrified that one day he'll listen to this, so I'll try to be careful. But
just say someone else's child.
Some kid.
I was at this random game recently.
He has no experience. I mean, he loves watching baseball on TV, but we haven't trained him at all. And he's 7, so he's starting a little later than some. And we were watching his first practice, and we noticed this disconnect where the coach would be instructing him, but he was misunderstanding. So, for example, every time a ball would come into field, Oliver would chase it. It doesn't matter if it was right next to him. It doesn't matter if it was in right field. He was chasing that ball. And the coach just kept saying, hey, don't compete for the ball. And Ollie was like, dude, I'm not competing. I'm just supposed to follow the ball. That's what you do, right? Or he would tell Oliver to choke up, and Oliver would cough. And he was like, and finally Oliver was like, I don't know what that means, which was funny. But it made me reflect a little bit on how frequently something can look like disobedience. And it is disobedience, but the root of that is ultimately ignorance. And so it's not so much rebellion as it is ignorance. And that's a fuzzy line, especially in real life. Those two things tend to come together.
Well, especially because there's so many areas of life, whether it's a particular sport or whether it's in music or science, where there is a specialized vocabulary.
Totally.
And, we talk about this a lot, how in the church, we have our own specialized vocabulary. And one of the things that puts people off who are not church people, they come in and they hear us using language that is totally foreign to them, and they have no frame of reference for what we're actually talking about. And it makes entry into church very difficult for a lot of people.
Totally.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to mind for me is not specialized vocabulary, but just relationships, and the phrase that we use sometimes, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get so frustrated with people or angry with people or decide we don't like someone, and then we hear some part of their story we didn't know, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, maybe this is where that aspect that rubs me the wrong way comes from. And then all of a sudden there's grace there and mercy and more of a relationship that can be built. And so it's one of those things where it's not that we're going to your point about ignorance, right? It's something we don't know about the situation or the people or even a leader, right? We might judge a leader for a decision that they make, but we don't have all the same information that they have. And so then one day we find out they had this information that we didn't know, and we're like, oh, what would I have done? Maybe it would have been more similar to what they decided.
That's exactly right. Well, and I think the reason it struck me so much there, and the reason it strikes me in so many situations, is we can get so frustrated when we are accused of being disobedient, when we just didn't know. And I love how the Old Testament, and these books in particular, go out of their way to tell us that God just isn't like this at all. And I think the reason this strikes me so much in the book of Judges is, well, we'll actually look at this passage together. I'll have somebody read it, and then I'll kind of try to connect how this passage proves to us that God is ultimately aware that there's an ignorance that needs to be addressed so that we can be obedient. Mm-hmm. So if someone could read for me from Judges chapter 2, let's go ahead and read 6 through 10.
I'll start. Judges chapter 2, verse 6. Previously, when Joshua had sent the people away, the Israelites had gone to take possession of the land, each to his own inheritance. The people worshipped the Lord throughout Joshua's lifetime and during the lifetimes of the elders who outlived Joshua. They had seen all the Lord's great works which he had done for Israel.
Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110 years old. So they buried him within the bounds of his inheritance in Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gaash. Moreover, that whole generation was gathered to their ancestors, and another generation grew up after them, who did not know the Lord, or the work that he had done for Israel.
Excellent. What's fascinating to me is right in that next verse, in verse 11, it will say, "Then the Israelites did evil." But it strikes me that before God says they were disobedient, they did evil, they did what I had said was a bad idea, he says they just didn't know.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah.
This isn't to get them off the hook. He's very clear in this passage that they are responsible for their disobedience. I mean, it's not softening it, but it is showing that this God wants to get to the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is that ignorance. And I think, again, when we pay attention to this, we actually catch something a little bit later in the chapter that can be super helpful for us as we read the book of Judges. And it helps us see that there's a little bit more going on than just did they follow or did they not. But God's actually trying, as he has in the past, not because he's not going to be successful. When God tries, he's always successful. He knows he's going to be successful. But God is working to show them something about himself as well.
That's really fascinating. And interesting to me is that it's the people that were immediately connected with Joshua, the generation after. So there's something significant about leadership and the transference through relationship that affects our faith. On one hand, I think how everyone has to come into relationship with God.
Yeah.
But for those who have a heritage of faith, you see that through line that their faithfulness to communicate who God is to the next generation does in fact affect the next generation after.
That's absolutely true.
There's a sense in which they needed another Deuteronomy, because you had the generation that received the law at Sinai, and then they died out in the wilderness. And before entering into the land, there's a new generation that had not been the recipients of that instruction at Sinai. And so Moses gives Deuteronomy, the second law, the second giving of Torah, for this new generation. And now after Joshua's passed off the scene, it's almost like they needed somebody to do something like that again.
Yeah, and Deuteronomy has those core verses about pass this on to your children, write it on the doorposts of your home, wear it on your forehead, right? Like
When
you're supposed to be passing
going,
this
yeah.
on. And so it almost raises the question, was the first disobedience the fact that it wasn't passed on to the next generation?
We often ask that question. What's tricky is when we look at this text in verse 7, it's really clear. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him and had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Both in Joshua and Judges, we tend to have these super positive statements about the Joshua generation. So then the question becomes, do we make this about how they haven't passed it on, or is there something else going on in terms of knowledge? For example, Gideon, later in the book, he'll actually recite everything that happened to his parents. So on some level they knew, which tells us this ignorance is something more than just head knowledge, because they seem to have something. And so what went wrong? Well, here, they didn't know the Lord, nor what he had done for Israel. There was some kind of experiential knowledge deficit. And we'll see that a little bit more in a second. Actually, why don't we just go there now? Let's go to chapter 3. And I'll have one of you read verses 1 through 2, if you would.
I'll take it. Now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who had not experienced it formerly.
Good. Here, he points out there's something about experiencing war. We read this verse and we say, okay, God is creating a nation. It must mean that he has to teach them how to fight. They're going to have to fight to survive. But what strikes me as interesting is, especially in the Hebrew, this is really clear, but we can see it in the English as well. He's talking about teaching. If this generation doesn't know things, here God's teaching. Where it says teach warfare to the descendants who had not had previous battle experience, what that actually says is those who had not known war, those who did not know. It's the same language from earlier in the chapter. And so what we have here is a generation who hadn't seen what God had done for Israel. What does it mean that God had done for Israel? Well, if you think from the Joshua generation and back through the Egypt generation, we're talking about those who had seen God fight for them.
Yeah.
What Judges seems to be saying is that this God is a God who liberates, who fights for you, who is powerful. And this God, at least right now, you haven't actually seen him do his thing. And you, because of that, are doubting that he's the powerhouse, that he's the one who can protect you. And you are very, very inclined then to turn to other sources of power for salvation. And I would argue what he's doing here is laying out the book of Judges is going to be a place where I let you experience what only your forefathers have experienced. I'm going to give you Deuteronomy. It's not going to be a second law giving, but I'm going to let you experience some of the same things.
Yeah, and what we'll definitely see is how self-destructive our behavior can become when we try to take that on ourselves, to protect ourselves or fight for ourselves or do, as is repeated over and over again in this book, what was right in our own eyes.
That's exactly right. And that's where the testing comes in. He's teaching them, but he's also watching how will they respond to this revelation. When they have had this experience, how then will they respond to me? And so looking at Judges this way, I always just find deeply encouraging, because this God who is fighting for my obedience, again, he is pursuing me, is the way that the Old Testament talks about it. We know that God doesn't need me. We know that God loves me. But the Old Testament language is this image of someone pursuing us relentlessly. That's the image that's used there. And the reason he's doing that is he doesn't just want to yell at me for my disobedience. He wants to meet me in my shortcoming, in my fear, in all my skewed views of him, and in his grace. He actually is fixing that so that we can be more obedient. We'll see him do that in a totally different way in the New Covenant and in the New Testament. But in the Old Testament, he starts there by addressing our own lack of knowledge so that we can come to know him better.
Helpful part of the conversation about how experiential knowledge of God, or the lack of it, seems to have been a factor in the trajectory of the book of Judges. Seems to be true that truth discovered and experienced is even more powerful than truth that is simply told. Well, in just a moment, we're going to keep moving ahead in the book of Judges to the stories of the first two mentioned and how they kind of set the stage for an ever-increasing, wow, I didn't see that coming type of way the Lord is making himself known through them. And we'll also talk about the repeating cycle that characterizes the stories in the times of the Judges. All right, but first, let's take time for a short break to tell you about Michelle's helpful new book on this part of Scripture. Well, we certainly are excited about having Michelle with us here for this extended look at the book of Judges. And if our conversations make you want to dig even deeper, she's written a book that just came out late last year called The Prophet's Anthem, the song of Deborah and Barak in the narrative of Judges. As we'll see, a prophet named Deborah was one of these judges, and her story and a song she wrote about a key victory God gave Israel over one of their oppressors is crucial for us to understand the entire narrative of the times of the Judges. We'll spend several segments during this study on that. But as I said, Judges can be a difficult book, and anyone who needs help making sense of it will appreciate the prophet's anthem. I think the way she draws us back to the fact that all these stories in Judges are a way of God making himself known. It changes how we read this section of the Old Testament. Search for The Prophet's Anthem by Michelle Knight on any number of online booksellers. Again, The Prophet's Anthem by Michelle Knight. wherever you buy books online. And now let's head back to the table where Bill has a question for Michelle that will further set us up to move into the stories of the first couple of these Judges.
Okay, Michelle, we're really glad you're here and taking us into the book of Judges, because I don't think any of the other three of us have done even remotely close to the kind of deep dive into Judges that you've done. But in my limited studies on Judges, I've always heard the term the cycle of apostasy or the cycle of rebellion, where you see repeated over and over in Judges. The children of Israel disobey. God brings a season of judgment, usually at the hand of one of the surrounding nations. Then God sends a deliverer, one of the judges, and that produces a time of maybe what we could call spiritual revival and return to an obedient life, which is then followed by a season of rebellion, and the thing repeats itself over and over again. And I'm just kind of interested how that idea, if at all, fits into your understanding of Judges.
Totally. I mean, there's no question that from chapter 3, verse 7, all the way through chapter 16, we are in what as scholars we call the cycles section, or the section where we see the cycle and cycle of people turning to God but then rebelling against him over and over. And in fact, it sort of gets worse, and we see that kind of fall apart toward the end of the book. What I like about starting in chapters 1 and 2, before I get to the cycle of oppression, is chapters 1 and 2 kind of give us a thesis statement about where the book of Judges is going. And that's where it talks about what we talked about in our previous episode about testing and teaching. And that testing part where he says, how then will you respond to my revelation? The cycle of apostasy is every time how they respond to his revelation. So what we'll see is in every narrative cycle, in each of the savior stories is another way we call them in the middle of the book, we're going to see them get saved. And the question will be, how then do they respond? And it'll be in that cycle of apostasy.
And when you talk about getting saved, you're not talking about getting
No,
saved
I
in the
am
New
not.
Testament sense. It's more of a rescue or deliverance,
That's exactly right. The word in Hebrew is savior, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But yes, these are stories where they are rescued in that very kind of military sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I think really jumps out to me about that is so often when we talk about the Bible, and even in the New Testament, we focus so much on people's sin and people as sinners and the people as the problem. No doubt that's there. But even in those conversations, we lose track of the fact that this is first and foremost a story about what God is doing and how he responds to sinners. And it's through meeting them where they are and rescuing them.
That's right.
And so there's that cycle is what gets missed when we get so laser focused on the cycle of, well, this is what the people were up to again. It's like, right, but don't lose sight of what God's up to. So thank you for that reminder.
Well, and that's what I'm kind of excited to draw our attention to in these stories is the way that as God is testing their response, he's also kind of upping the ante a little bit in the way that he proves to them just how mighty he is. And part of the way we see that is in each of the kind of enemies that come against Israel. Okay. So if you look at chapter 3 in Judges 3, we're going to meet our first of 3 that I'm going to talk about right now. If somebody could read verses 7 and 8, please.
Sure. The Israelites did what was evil in the Lord's sight. They forgot the Lord their God and worshipped the Baals and the Asherah. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he sold them to King Cushan-Rishathaim of Aram Naharaim.
I feel kind of guilty making you read that. You did excellent.
Oh,
Vivian.
well,
thank you
you.
so much
You
for
could
your
just
service.
go with the,
Sure.
KCR
Yes.
and AN.
Well, here's the thing. His name is actually super important. We know almost nothing about Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim. But when I read that out loud, did you notice how sing-songy it is?
Mm-hmm.
Most Judges scholars will tell you that this is actually kind of a made-up name to tell us something about him. Cushan-Rishathaim in Hebrew means dark, doubly wicked one.
Wow.
His name is very...
No wonder Marlene calls me that all the time.
Yeah, that's why it's your nickname.
Yes.
Yeah, it's actually a very ominous title. And he's coming from Mesopotamia. Aram Naharaim is Mesopotamia, which in the ancient Near East is very far removed from Israel. So the fact that someone from that empire pretty far away was coming all the way in to give everybody some trouble, man, that is a significant threat. I mean, the story, we don't hear much about it other than that God raises up Othniel, and through Othniel, he saves his people. But God starts out the book of Judges by saying, let me bring someone with a reputation for wickedness from way farther out than you could have possibly perceived as a threat, and show you that it's not going to be a problem at all to address that. And that leads us into the second story. So let's look at the Ehud narrative, which is same chapter, chapter 3. If somebody could read 12 through 14, that would be helpful.
The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord strengthened King Eglon of Moab against Israel, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. In alliance with the Ammonites and the Amalekites, he went and defeated Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. So the Israelites served King Eglon of Moab 18 years.
All right, great. And so did you notice in the first story, they served this king for 8 years. Now they're serving for 18. So we have seen kind of the sense in which they were militarily occupied is quite a bit longer. Mm-hmm. And on top of them, did you catch that the narrator says God strengthened Eglon? Mm-hmm. The emphasis there in that he's kind of a normal-ish king, but God actually gave him extra strength, which is important. If we started out with a kind of scary king, God again is going to be like, well, now let me show you what kind of king I can defeat. And so he brings in Eglon, and Eglon is allied with the Ammonites and the Amalekites. So not only is he strong, but he is well allied. Mm. And we know from war in the modern world what a difference that makes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious with these stories. So we see language in the first story. So the Lord sells them off. Yeah. The Lord strengthens. In the ancient Near East, it was very common for people to experience something bad and say, well, God must have done this because of the bad thing. So how much can we read into that where is God doing that? Or as a result of the people putting everything in their own hands, doing what was right in their own eyes, there's a self-destructiveness that comes that makes them vulnerable to these different kings. Yeah. And then when they look back on that story, they're like, well, God must have done that. Yeah. But really it was just a king invading because of that self-destructiveness of the people. So how much of it is actually God? How much of it's not God? I mean, do we know?
I am prone to say, if the text is saying it's God, I want to take that seriously in the narrative being constructed. That dual agency is always a factor in Hebrew narratives, where there's this sense in which obviously the people are making themselves prone to that. But within the framework of the story, like in chapter 2, we have God talk about, I'm no longer going to kick out the people in front of you. And instead, I'm going to leave these other nations. The Hebrew there actually isn't to leave. It says cause to rest. I'm going to make them rest. He's going to bring in people from the outside and help them occupy the land, is kind of the way that is worded, which is interesting for a variety of reasons. One of them being that he told the Israelites he would make them rest in the land. But I guess what I would say is throughout the Old Testament, that dual agency is always on display, where we definitely see the people opening themselves up to it. I mean, in the modern world, we constantly say this happened because of this diplomatic mistake, because of this. There's always that dual agency. But the story of Daniel, the story of Judges always steps back and says God is raising up and tearing down kingdoms kind of under this general sovereignty.
You see a similar thing in the Elisha story with Naaman, the Syrian general who was so respected and appreciated by his king. It says, because he won many battles by the hand of the Lord.
Sure.
And, I read that and I just kind of take it at face value, even though I know that many of those battles must have been against Israel because they were constantly raiding into Israel at that time. So, the idea of the dual agency, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, theology kind of provides that to us, and I think it's a helpful framework for making sense of what we're seeing and what seems like conflicting biblical passages. What's cool about Ehud is I think he sounds hysterical to us because he's the super fat king and like he gets, jabbed and we see fat clothes over his wound. But what's interesting is we're in a place where people are fighting poverty, they're fighting malnutrition.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in this story, we see Ehud carrying a tribute. A tribute is an ancient Near Eastern term for when you were occupied militarily. In the contemporary world, that means we pay taxes to the people in charge. They were actually bringing the food of the promised land in tribute. Ehud's job is carrying the fat of the promised land to the king getting fat off of the fat of the land. It's like the land flowing with milk and honey, all that milk and honey is going straight to this dude who is now getting fat on it. So even as we see him being called fat, he turns into this like comical pig in our head. But within the story, he is eating and Israel's starving. In fact, later on in the story, his people will be called strong. In 3:29, it says, at that time they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. In Hebrew, that's the exact same word that describes Eglon, the king. So it's probably not saying that they're all fat. It's saying that they're well fed at a time where the Israelites are starving in the land where they should be eating from God's bounty. And so when we step back and look at that first story, which was this dark and so wicked person, now we step into a new story where someone's well-fed and well-allied and actually stealing the goods of the promised land. And we're going to get into the next story, and these people are going to be armed to the teeth. I'll kind of save that for what the conversation we're about to have. But when we get into chapter 4 and we meet Sisera and we meet the kings of Canaan, they're going to have iron chariots, which are like the epitome of warfare technology in the day. And so they're about to come up against the most well-armed army you can imagine. So when we step back and say, what is God teaching his people? Even as he's testing their response, he is becoming increasingly impressive in the way that he shows just how strong he is. This first cycle, he's saved with a war hero. Othniel's a war hero. Ehud is kind of low-key a warrior, for sure, but he comes off just looking like a tribute bearer. He's the one handing off the fat of the promised land. And preview of coming attractions, in chapter 4.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, he's gonna win the battle with a housewife. And so we see him every time say, the enemy looks more and more impressive. And in your eyes, the deliverer looks less and less impressive. And he's saying, I'm about to show you just how great I am. I think that's helpful for us as we kind of look out in the world and we can be overwhelmed by things that seem sort of insurmountable. The nice thing about the book of Judges is it reminds us there's no evil, no power, no injustice, that God is not powerful enough to conquer. And we can kind of learn that right along with the people.
Yeah, that's one of the things about the book of Judges and how God is making himself known during this time. The surprising people that he uses in the process. And it really is a theme that runs through both the Old and New Testaments. The Apostle Paul summarized it in one of his letters to the Corinthians this way. He said that God uses broken vessels so that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. That is so often how God makes himself known. Well, in this next segment, they're going to explore the story of that judge that Michelle wrote that book about I mentioned earlier. The story of Deborah and Barak and Jael and Sisera reinforces once again this deliverance coming from a surprising place theme. And it is a classic example of that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us.
So we've been talking together a little bit about the book of Judges. And in the last conversation, I had kind of given a spoiler alert of the fact that God has been in these stories building the way that he is revealing himself to his people. Not because he needs to make a reputation to feel good, but because he recognizes it is so crucial for them to understand what's true and what's right. And that the God they serve is actually where they should be turning for help.
Yeah.
And so he's really trying to convince them that he is the one who can provide them what their deepest needs are. And we had shown that in the first couple of narrative cycles, the first couple stories in Judges, he had shown that by using a very powerful enemy and then increasingly a less expected person to be a part of how he saved his people. And we're going to see kind of the epitome of that here in Judges 4. And so let's go ahead and just read. We're going to start in verses 6 through 10 of chapter 4 to get us oriented to the story, and then I'll kind of fill it out a little bit more from there. Who would like to read that?
I'll start it off. Verse 6, now she, so we probably ought to figure out who she is.
Yeah.
Looks like, go back to verse 4, it's Deborah, a prophetess. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Now she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, Behold, the Lord, the God of Israel, has commanded, Go and march to Mount Tabor, and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. And I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand.
Great. Let's read 8, 9, and 10 as well.
Sure. Barak said to her, If you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. I will gladly go with you, she said, but you will receive no honor on the road you are about to take, because the Lord will sell Sisera to a woman. So Deborah got up and went with Barak to Kadesh.
Part of why I wanted us to kind of look at this text is I wanted to highlight how even Barak is about to be surprised by the person that's going to win this battle. It's going to be a woman. And kind of the connotation of that term we'll get to in a second. But we have met Deborah, a prophet. She is the one who's judging Israel at that time. So she's the judge over Israel. She's also a prophet. We see Samuel do that. Samuel is both a prophet and a judge. So he's going to fulfill both of those roles as well. And so she is the one on the ground through whom God chooses to speak, to say, okay, it's battle time. We're doing this thing. You have been suffering long enough under the Canaanites. Interestingly, in chapter 4, we finally actually meet the Canaanites. If you look back in Judges, in chapter 3, the first two narratives, when they are in these wars, it's actually not against the people who live in the land. It's people that God has brought from outside the land. This is the first time they're actually fighting people that live there. And all we know about them is they have these iron chariots. To us, iron chariots aren't that impressive. And to be clear, actually, they probably just had iron axles. That's probably about as much of them as there were iron. They might have been iron plated. There's a lot of archaeologists that argue about these things. But they are advanced weaponry for the day.
Yeah, they were the cutting edge of military technology, which is why in one of the Psalms it says, some trust in chariots.
That's right.
Some trust in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to contextualize that. And even more clearly, in Joshua and Judges, Judah is kind of heralded as a really great tribe because they always did everything God asked when it came to war. He said that you need to conquer this area, and they always did, except whenever there were iron chariots. Iron chariots have been kind of the thorn in the side of God's people to this point.
Yeah, which you don't bring a knife to a gunfight. You don't, right? There's a lot of sayings we have about why you don't pick on someone who's bigger and stronger than you.
You don't pull on Superman's
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And so the chariots have considerably been something the Israelites have been rightfully scared of to this point. And so in this story, we have this prophet coming to Barak, who's going to lead the army. And he's like, listen, if you are going to go with me, you as God's representative, if you come with me, then I have more confidence because I actually kind of I know something about God, and I know that if you are with me, we are way more likely to win this battle. But what's interesting is she responds by saying, no, we're going to do this even more unexpectedly than God's done to this point. And she says, because a woman's actually going to save him. What do you think that means when she says a woman's going to save them? What's the connotation of that term?
Well, you have to take it in the context of the culture. In our culture, if you said something like that today, 90% of the women listening would be offended.
I would be offended. Yeah.
Why does it matter that a woman's going to? I mean, why can't she? But back in that time, women didn't go to war. Women didn't fight battles. Women had a very different, much more secondary role in the community than the men did. It was the men who fought the battles and fought the wars.
And I think that first part's really helpful. Go ahead.
Yes, and I'm curious because you've done so much study. Can you just briefly dip into Deborah being in this role as judge, prophet? I mean, that seems pretty significant as well, that Barak would trust her.
Sure. Briefly, I'll just say, I mean, we have female prophets throughout the Old Testament. So female prophets kind of, frankly, freak us out more than they would have freaked out the Israelites. I mean, we have Josiah going to Huldah, who's another prophet. And there's, again, gender isn't even a part of the story. It's not a problem. And female prophets were at Mari, we have all kinds of female prophets. And so that part isn't as surprising as her being a judge. But even there, we know it's a rarity because we don't have other female judges. What we don't know, or what isn't clear from this text at least, is whether that was a problem. The text doesn't say it's a problem for her to be there. It just says she was there. And so sometimes we use other texts to kind of inform whether we see that as a problem or not. But within the context, all we know is there wasn't another woman. We don't know whether there was supposed to or was not supposed to be. And as far as we can tell, she was a prophet. And what's interesting about the story is it seems way more interested in the fact that she's a prophet than the fact that she's a judge. Because it kind of makes a passing comment about her being a judge. But the rest of the time, she's saying things like, has not Yahweh commanded? You know who else always said that? Moses. He's the other person that always talks about Yahweh commanding. People coming up to get judgment, which is what it says they do with Deborah, is what they did with Moses.
Right.
So she's carrying on this prophetic mantle. She is a spokesperson for God.
Which is really important because as you helped us see when we started this whole thing, chapter 2, verse 10.
Yes.
Moreover, they did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel.
Yes.
And the primary role of a prophet was not telling the future or something like that, but reminding the people, this is who God is, and this is what God asks of his people.
That's exactly right. So by the time we get to this story, not only has God been kind of implicitly proving something to the Israelites about how strong he is and how it's in their best interest to turn to him, now he says, I'm going to also send you a prophet who's going to interpret everything that happens so that you catch that message. I think that is what I love about this story more than anything, is we have people with deep-seated misunderstandings about God, like all of us, honestly. Right. And he doesn't just show them. He doesn't just test them. Now he's going to send someone to explain it to them along the way. Like, what a God. First of all, what a kind and generous God. But on top of that, her job will be to draw out what we have been drawing out implicitly from the narrative. She's going to do it explicitly, especially in the next story. But in this particular story, before we get to Judges 5, which is where she's going to speak to all the people, to all the surrounding nations, she's going to kind of give a prophetic speech. Before that, she has one interaction with Barak. And this story is about one man and how God got into his heart and changed things. I often tell my students, and I think it's true, I'd be interested to see if you think this is true. I have a better time believing that God is in charge of rainstorms and tsunamis than I am at believing that, like, he can change the heart of my family member. Or like, it's easier for me to believe he's in charge of nature than it is that he can actually affect someone who has this kind of deep-seated misunderstanding or anger or bitterness. I personally struggle with that. I don't know if you ever have.
Well, as the creator, obviously, I think it is easy for us to assume that God has power over nature and so forth. I think the point where we struggle with is not that he can bring rainstorms and tsunamis, but why would he?
Well, totally. Of course. And that is the bigger question always is, what are you doing and why is it so hard for us to see? So I think that's useful to remember, even as we kind of reflect on he is constantly moving people and the world kind of into where it needs to be for him to do his work.
That reminds me of in Proverbs 21, verse 1, it says, a king's heart is like channeled water in the Lord's hand. He directs it wherever he chooses. Yeah. And I struggle, too, with thinking God is all-powerful, and yet I continue to pray for my parents' salvation.
Yeah. Decades
of praying, and I imagine listeners as well. You know, just... God, you are all powerful, and your timing is one that I can't understand. Yeah. And yet you invite me into a relationship where I am needing to trust you with something that matters more than for me at this point.
Well, and that's a helpful reframing, that once we do become convinced that he is powerful enough to do that, then the question is, well, why haven't you? Which is a much longer conversation.
Yeah, there's a sense in which nature does not resist God, but the human heart does. And so there are opposing forces at work.
Yeah, the Psalms will use that a lot.
Yeah,
They'll talk about creation obeying the commands of God, kind of implicitly reminding us that we don't.
Yeah.
But I think in this story, we have God meeting someone at a place that's kind of very standard. And I think that's why I like this story so much. Barak is in a place believing certain things about God that are so normal. What we're going to see is him saying, hey, come on with me. Come on with me to battle, please, because I know that you're on God's side. He doesn't say that explicitly. And then when we have Deborah's response, let's look back at that. In verse 9, she says, I'm going to read from the NIV. Certainly I will go with you, said Deborah. But because of the course you're taking, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman. We talked earlier, and I thought you got it this well, Bill. You said that women didn't fight in ancient Israel. And I think that is the kind of key information we need here. I think sometimes we turn the story into such like an honor-shame thing, where she's kind of the lowliest of society. But maybe even more right there on the surface is that women don't go to war. We have in Numbers, it's very clear that this is a militia, if we want to kind of put it in contemporary terms, where we call up the people and it's men of a certain age or older. Who doesn't go to war? Levites, women, and children. And so in the context of battle, she says, listen, you, Barak, are heading in this direction, and there you are actually not going to get the honor of winning the battle, because God is actually going to win the battle not with a warrior. It's going to be with a civilian, is maybe what I would say is the connotation of the word woman here. It's civilian. He thinks, a very natural thing, that the strength of his army is crucial for winning. And that is what Deborah is trying to clarify. And so she says, you're actually not. That's not where you're going to get it. It's going to be in a totally different direction. So Deborah goes with Barak to Kadesh, and he summons the troops, and they do their thing. In this story, Jael is going to be painted as far removed from the Israelite army as possible. Now, see, we talked about Deborah and we talked about the woman mentioned here, but it's good for us all to remember that the woman who actually is going to rescue the army, the one who's actually going to defeat the enemy commander, is Jael, not Deborah. It's Jael, who is just on her homestead. Sisera is going to run away from the battle because God did amazing things on the battlefield. And he's going to come to the tent and he's going to be like, hey, I need help. The reason he goes to her tent, well, there are several reasons. One of them is her husband is actually allied with Canaan. Her husband is a Kenite. And we see, right, I think it's in, let's go down to like verse
17, I think.
17. We have Sisera, meanwhile, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there was an alliance between Jabin, king of Hatzor, and the family of Heber the Kenite. So he goes to someone he considers an ally. So not only do we have a woman who's a civilian, but now she's non-Israelite. And on top of that, she is allied with Canaan. And we will find she brings him in. She, for whatever reason, we're actually never told why. We don't know why she did what she did. She brings him in, she lulls him to sleep. She kind of gives him the finest, milk and curds is what the Bible says, but it's basically a really nice drink that you would serve to someone to honor them. Puts him to sleep, and she drives a tent peg through his head. Think about the irony of the most well-armed enemy we meet in this book being killed not by a weapon of war, but by a domestic implement, a tent peg. So in every way, Barak assumed that battle happened in a particular sphere.
Right.
God removes it from that sphere entirely because he observes that this people is going to think this is about human might. And I'm just not going to let that misconception sink in.
Yeah, it just reminds me of all the ways that we see in our lives when God surprises us by meeting a need through someone surprising or someone we don't even know, or makes his presence known and tangible to us in some way in a really surprising like movie or a song that we didn't expect or something like that. I just see some of that mysteriousness of the way God can move outside of the ways that we expect him to sometimes.
Yeah.
And sometimes when he does, those become the most memorable and the most meaningful moments of our lives. So I know that's not what this story is about for me today, but that's how that little seed of truth in this story of God's surprising character and the way that he shows up can really meet us where we are too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I do think at some level, this is really straightforwardly about that.
Yeah.
If this is at some level, even as this book is showing us the kind of wayward patterns of the people, it's showing us how God is usurping their expectations about how the world works. And this becomes the kind of pinnacle of that. And in the next chapter, which we'll talk about in a little bit later, Deborah is going to explain that to make sure they understand this is the God who defies expectations. So that when you come up against a huge army, or when we operate in the world overwhelmed by like racism that seems so deep-seated, or patterns that humans live in that just like, how are they going to beat addiction? Like these things seem so insurmountable. The point is, this is a God who consistently usurps those expectations to the glory of his name.
Yeah, that's one of the key messages of the book of Judges, one of the things that God is revealing about who he is and what he's like. And as Michelle said, the next chapter is a really important one in the story of Deborah and Barak as well. It's the song she writes, and they sing together, a duet, that becomes a way of future generations learning this about what God is like and how he works. Generations that extend all the way to ours. So we'll wrap up part one of our study with Michelle Knight about the times of the Judges after we take a quick time out. Now, Discover the Word is part of Our Daily Bread Ministries, and we are a donor-funded nonprofit ministry. It's the generous support of listeners like you that makes it possible for us to work toward fueling a worldwide Bible engagement movement with a number of different kinds of resources, including this radio show podcast. And we really do feel like it's a privilege to come alongside you and open the Scriptures to discover Jesus together. Now, one listener shared this message with us. It's one of my favorites over the last couple of weeks. He wrote, "I must say that I have participated in many studies and looked at many resources in my nearly 70 years, but I have never found any as spiritually enlightening or thought-provoking as Discover the Word. I can read Scripture 1,000 times, but to gain the perspective that DTW provides is unique. I originally bumped into it about 30 years ago and have been listening on and off throughout the years. Thank you for letting me participate in the conversation." Well, Michael, it's been an honor to study with you all these years. Knowing that you're at the table with us really is encouraging. And what also is encouraging is when faithful friends like Michael help us share the life-changing story and wisdom of the Bible by making a one-time donation or by becoming a monthly partner. If you'd like to partner with us in that way, visit discovertheword.org and look for the Donate button that's up at the top of the page. discovertheword.org and click Donate. So, do you have a song, or maybe a couple of songs, or favorite hymns that have been extra meaningful to you in your relationship with God? Almost always, the song relates to some kind of experience you were going through, and that song just touched you at a very deep level. When you think about that situation, that song has a way of making what God is like real to you. Songs do that. And so next, we're going to look at a song that we find in the Old Testament book of Judges, a song that was a major factor in making what God is like known to generations.
So in our previous conversation, we had started talking about Judges 4, which is where we meet Deborah who is a judge and a prophet, and we meet Barak, who's the general of the army. And we're kind of watching their conversations, and we learn that Barak is really sure the military is the means through which God saves. And he might have even lost track of some of God's work in that, because he starts to think, it seems that he is pretty sure the might of the army might be part of that. That'll become clear in this chapter, and we'll get into that in a second. But what we saw is the way that God used Jael, who is just a housewife. Mm-hmm. And I'm using housewife anachronistically, and I also think that housewives are amazing, but they are not the person you picture to be the one who is fighting a general. And so the fact that God used this civilian woman as his instrument there kind of is starting to destabilize the narrative that this army and perhaps their strength is the way that God saves. He's been destabilizing that over the last couple chapters. But what I love about Judges 5, which is where we're going to kind of shift our focus now, is that in this song, we're going to see Deborah stand up, and she's going to explain everything she's just seen. Judges 5 is kind of a rare moment in Scripture where we have a story told in narrative form, and then the story is retold on the lips of someone speaking. We have something kind of like it in Exodus 14 and 15, where Moses retells what happens at the Red Sea. Yeah. But here in poetry, in chapter 5, she's going to retell the story, or sing it, technically, as is common after battle.
And it's an oral culture where they don't have access to writing. That's in the way that we think of it today. So they don't just have books or journals where they're writing all the details down. So a really good way to remember what happened would be to create a song out of it and sing it and sing it and be reminded.
Just like at the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses is about to die and he says, I need you all to remember your history rightly, God has him write a song. And he says, as long as the song's in your head, you'll be able to remember this correctly. And this seems to have the same effect. In fact, pro tip, Judges 5 is actually quoted in Psalm 68. And so depending on when Psalm 68 is written, it sounds like it worked. The song did get stuck in their head, and people have remembered it, and we see it kind of affecting the way that they interpret their situation at that time.
Do you want Bill to sing Judges 5 for us?
I feel like that would be a really helpful addition to the podcast.
I feel that you're mistaken.
I've been wrong before, so I'll believe you on that. Maybe my favorite part about this song, though, before we even get into it, and Bill, maybe you have it open there. Could you read for us again 5:1, how it introduces the song?
Then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying...
Okay, did y'all notice? We tend to call this Deborah's song, but did you notice that Barak and Deborah sing?
Yeah.
That is maybe one of the most overlooked facets of this song. The last story that we just talked about was the story of Barak having this misconception and about God providing an opportunity for him to see things differently. We didn't really get there, and we can go there now. If we look in chapter 4 toward the end, we had seen Jael invite Sisera into the tent. She drove a tent peg through his head. And then in verse 22 of chapter 4, Vivian, would you read that?
Sure.
22 and 23, please.
Yes. When Barak arrived in pursuit of Sisera, Jael went out to greet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man you are looking for." So he went in with her, and there was Sisera lying dead with a tent peg through his temple.
Ugh.
Yeah, a gruesome scene. We sterilize that a little bit, I think, when we talk about it, or especially when we teach kids about it, if we teach kids about it. But think about how important that is. We don't need that scene to know what happened. Mm-hmm. The story could have ended with Jael having defeated Sisera. We only have that because it shows us that Barak got to witness what had happened. Considering that this started with Barak has a misconception and Deborah says, no, that's not how it's going to work. It ended with Barak actually having that misconception fixed because like the Israelites, after they had crossed the Red Sea, finally seen everyone dead on the seashore, finally believed that God could save, Barak has that same like, oh, this woman defeated this ferocious general. And that changes something in him to the extent that when chapter 5 comes along, he sings the same words the prophet does. For one of the rare times in the book of Judges, God's spokesperson, the prophet, and the general are on the same page. And that is evidence to us that realignment actually worked.
It's interesting because we even try to clarify that when Deborah said the Lord will sell Sisera to a woman, that he might have thought it was Deborah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so to have that completion of, this is not what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah. And so that way, I think what's cool about this is Barak is kind of a representative of a whole group of people who maybe has lost sight of how God saves. We know that from the introduction to Judges. And they all are pretty sure it happens in particular ways through particular people. But if he is representative of a whole people, we can't stop in chapter 4 with just him having changed his mind. While a leader changing is so important, and we see through the history of the Old Testament how important that is, Judges 5 is where he now becomes a part of telling everyone else what he has seen. We'll see in the song itself, what happens in Jael's tent is recounted. Deborah wasn't there, at least according to the narrative. She may have been. If she was traveling with Barak, she might have followed him. But it's almost as if it's told from his perspective. Let's look at that. It's in 5 verses 24 and following. So 5:24 through 27. Would somebody read that?
I can. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, of tent-dwelling women most blessed. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank, he fell. He lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead.
Yeah. When I have my students read this out loud, I always tell them to picture, like if we're in the middle of a movie, generally when the enemy is getting his comeuppance, when the bad guy is about to fall, almost always the music climbs and you see it almost in slow motion, the fall happen. That's the effect in the Hebrew poetry of verse 27. We even heard it reading it in English. He fell, he sank, he fell, there he lay, he fell, he sank, he fell. It slows everything down. And the effect of this is not to glorify death. God is not a God of death. He's a God of life. But to say, if you are so sure this man is unbeatable, I want you to take in very slowly and carefully that he is beatable, that I defeated him. And the person through whom I defeated him was someone who was a civilian. And a tent-dwelling civilian, which meant she was pretty vulnerable, too.
Right. Totally unexpected.
Totally unexpected. And so when Barak became convinced of this, his private experience kind of becomes public knowledge now.
Right.
And that's sort of the kind of key feature of the song. The song is devoted to kind of welcoming everybody in to watching this and to understanding. But one of the key things Deborah and Barak with her will tell the people to do is to tell this story again. So if we go back to verses 10 and 11, if someone could read chapter 5, verses 10 and 11, that would be helpful.
I can do that. You who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who travel on the road, sing. At the sound of those who divide flocks among the watering places, there they shall recount the righteous deeds of the Lord, the righteous deeds for his peasantry in Israel. Then the people of the Lord went down to the gates.
So we have there this moment where she's like, listen, all y'all, she said all y'all. I can tell.
She was southern.
She said all y'all who are traveling along the road. Now, earlier in the song, it had talked about Israel being so occupied that it was like nobody was on the roads. The roads were empty. All of a sudden in verse 10, she's like, okay, all of you who are now on the roads traveling freely because something has changed, you have one job. And your job is to sing this song. Your job is to think about what you've heard. Now, you heard the people at the watering places, the watering cooler. You heard everybody standing around singing this song, talking about what happened. Your job is to join them. What you heard recounted, you've got to continue recounting. There is a power in someone who has experienced change firsthand, and someone who has become convinced of God's power, of them relaying that message. In some ways, that is more powerful. Maybe we've experienced that than a pastor saying something, maybe even than a prophet saying something, because they have the power to say, you know me, you know where I was 3 days ago, and now I'm in this other place. And that carries weight. And so the Song of Deborah will, in future times, we might actually talk a little bit more about what that message is doing and what she is saying in that song. But even beyond just the core theological message, we have this underlying, we change this guy's mind. He now is trying to change your mind, and your job is to change other people's minds. Because that is where real change happens in a society. God needs to meet the people where they're at, and they all need to start thinking differently.
Yeah. It reminds me too of in our own history, at the end of slavery, which by no means fixed the problems that were happening, but the celebration that happened, the songs that were written about the end of slavery, especially in the Black church, which is really featured in Rasul, who's sometimes on our show as well. He was a part of a documentary on Juneteenth and how faith and freedom together were celebrated at Juneteenth at the end of slavery. And that's kind of what this story reminds me of, that story, where there's these songs that are passed down. There's this celebration that happens that were the everyday people that were being affected by the evil of slavery.
That's right.
I'm sure there were pastors talking about it, but it was so much more powerful to hear that in the songs of the people that were once enslaved and then had been set free. And I see that here. No wonder this type of a song is passed down even to us today, because it's a celebration of God's rescue, and what a beautiful thing that is.
Yeah.
The same thing from the other end of it would be John Newton writing Amazing Grace, a former captain of a slaving ship who declares in his song, this is what I was, this is who I am now, and it's all because of God's grace.
That's right. And those songs have this inherent power because they allow the kind of slow and steady transformation of someone singing that song again and again, of it sort of sinking into their bones and becoming the way they see the world. And this song that Barak sang with Deborah is going to have that function for the people of God.
And right there, we're going to have to put this study of the book of Judges with our friend Dr. Michelle Knight on pause and pick it up once again next time. We'll stay in the story of Deborah and Barak to begin part 2, and then we'll move on to some key moments in the rest of the book as well. But actually, what we'll do is begin with a question that Daniel will voice for us that I think kind of is a foundational question that we'd like to have an answer to.
Michelle, thank you for a great first week diving into Judges. It's been really good. But even just saying that name, diving into Judges, I don't see any like black robes or people sitting on a bench making decisions about what the law says about this person and whether they should go to jail or not. So I'm wondering if Judges is even a helpful term, or where it comes from, or why do we even call it Judges when it doesn't seem like we're seeing any judges?
No, this is the right question to ask.
And so hear Michelle's answer when we pick up with part 2 of our study of the times of the Judges. Discover the Word is a small group Bible study from Our Daily Bread Ministries in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in which we invite you to walk with us through topics and passages that inform the way we read the Scriptures, challenge us as we live our lives as followers of Christ, and always point us to discover Jesus in the pages of the Bible. Well, thanks for listening. I'm Brian Hettinga. Discover the Word is provided by Our Daily Bread Ministries, fueling a global Bible engagement movement.